Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here with you all today. My name is Hauwa Otori, and I'm a staff researcher at the GitHub Security Lab, where I lead our socio-technical research and explore the relationships between developer and security research communities. Today, I want to talk to you about improving developer and researcher communication. And I want to talk to you about 3 specific points. Number 1, the perceptions open source maintainers and security researchers have of each other. Number 2, the impact of these perceptions and how both communities interact in the vulnerability disclosure process. And 3, I want to leave you with best practices to implement for a more effective vulnerability disclosure process. So, why does this matter? If you can communicate better, it will lead to better outcomes. Less friction in what otherwise could be a challenging process, and getting to a shared solution in a faster way. And you might even feel better along the way. Today, the security research community lacks uniformity in vulnerability disclosure. It's essentially the process of reporting and communicating details of a potential risk with the goal of fixing it. I previously had the opportunity to lead an industry coalition, and I noticed a couple of things. Number 1, organizations like Google Project Zero, GitHub Security Lab, HackerOne, they all have their own processes for disclosing vulnerabilities. And 2, oftentimes industry focuses heavily on building security tooling, rather than focusing on the interactions and the relationships between these 2 key stakeholder communities. In a disparate system, understanding the relationships among stakeholders can lead to more effective actions to remedy vulnerabilities. This understanding will ultimately lead to a safer, more secure, and more collaborative ecosystem. Now, before we go any further, I want you to take a second and think about the last time you had a group project. Any project that required a collective effort. Maybe it's a cross-functional project at work, or perhaps you're a GitHub campus expert and it's a university project at your campus. Now, think about your relationships with your group members before you started working with them. You may have had perceptions about them before you got to know them in a real way. And those perceptions likely shape the way you interact and engage with them. In other words, how we think and feel about someone often sets a tone for how we engage with them. And that's no different for open source maintainers and security research communities. A few months ago, I had the chance to bring a group of maintainers and researchers from across the globe together in one space to talk about their perceptions. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. What I found interesting about those conversations was not necessarily how one group perceived the other, but rather how one group believed that the other group perceived them. So, for instance, maintainers said, "We believe researchers perceive us to be, quote, lazy or lacking willpower when it came to their inability to rectify certain security vulnerabilities." While researchers believed that developers viewed them as irresponsible and not wanting to understand maintainers, but simply wanting to blow everything up. And these perceptions, regardless of their truth, bleed into the way these communities interact and communicate with each other. And that's what we wanted to delve into at the lab. We picked a process where both of these groups engage regularly and ask the following question. How can we improve communication between security researchers and open source maintainers within the vulnerability disclosure process? So I explained the process briefly, but to give you a visual overview, here are 3 key steps. Number 1, the researcher identifies a vulnerability and details their finding in a report. 2, the researcher shares the report with the maintainer. And 3, they collaborate and work towards a resolution within a 90-day period, which is typically the industry standard. We had 4 key goals that we wanted to accomplish with this work. Number 1, whether open source maintainers have established views on security in the security research community. Whether maintainers understand the role of security researchers, whether they are receptive to communications from this group, and lastly, whether they understand the messaging used in disclosure reports. Now, every good study starts with a hypothesis. Our initial hypothesis was that open source maintainers would express dissatisfaction with their interactions and communication with the research community. Here's what we found. In terms of maintainers engaging with the security research community, most of the participants said they had little to no engagement within the security research community. This isn't great news because this simply reinforces perceptions rather than basing their views on direct experience with that community. But when they do interact beyond disclosure reports, some maintainers mention they engage with researchers through other avenues, particularly social channels like Twitter, Slack, Discord, and other conversations with friends and interpersonal connections. Maintainers said they would appreciate an advisory collaborative relationship with security researchers. Maintainers also reported that their interactions were generally positive or pleasant. In fact, one maintainer said that their experience was, quote, pretty positive, mostly because I know what the perspective is. In other words, this particular person was not only a maintainer, but had also been on the research side as well. So they understood both communities, they understood both of their roles and their point of view. But this wasn't universally true. Some characterized their interactions with researchers as pretty obscure and running the gamut depending on the researcher. One maintainer reported that despite their attempts to interact with the community, they felt excluded. They saw the community as less than inclusive and wanted to see the issue addressed. Now, when it comes to the actual reporting process and receiving reports, maintainers typically experience a range of emotions, including anxiety and stress. However, they are appreciative of constructive feedback. One maintainer said, "My initial emotional response is, 'Oh no, how bad is it?' This indicates the immediate alarmist response some maintainers feel after receiving a disclosure report." Another maintainer said, "We're open to receiving constructive feedback. However, sometimes communication from researchers crosses the line." And when the line is crossed, this maintainer said that they often set additional boundaries. When these boundaries are set, the maintainer reported that oftentimes researchers respond by expressing frustration with the process and apologizing. However, other researchers kind of double down on their language, and at that point, the maintainer has to decide whether to move forward with the engagement or not. When we asked maintainers how they wanted to receive disclosure reports, overwhelmingly, maintainers prefer to receive them privately. One maintainer mentioned they've experienced disclosures coming from various channels, including Twitter. While a majority of maintainers would prefer that researchers submit reports privately, some researchers are trending towards submitting reports through public issues and other social platforms. One researcher said it could prompt maintainers to fix issues faster. In terms of contacting maintainers, a majority of maintainers said they have a designated security contact via email. However, most don't yet have a security policy. They either don't have one yet or plan to implement one moving forward. While there's a general consensus that 90 days is a standard reasonable timeline, maintainers also want to maintain the flexibility with this timeline and have a more collaborative process with researchers in the event that the potential risk could take more time to fix. In terms of best practices, we'll start with maintainers. First, set a designated security contact. Many of you are already doing that, as well as a policy. A security policy allows maintainers to standardize and normalize how vulnerability reports are delivered and how they want to track them moving forward. Number 2, responsiveness and collaboration. One researcher mentioned that they had found a vulnerability or potential vulnerability in a well-known project. They took the time to detail their findings and share that with the maintainer. During the 90-day period, they followed up with this maintainer a few times. However, they heard no response. Ultimately, after the 90-day period was completed, the maintainer finally fixed the issue. However, the researcher was discouraged because they didn't hear a word from the maintainer after all that work they had put into it. It's important to acknowledge that you've received reports and to then move forward with the collaboration. And lastly, set boundaries in communication. If someone is crossing the line, feel free to let them know, and who knows, the conversation could become even more productive after that. Now, in terms of best practices for researchers, the first thing is use a positive feedback sandwich. One maintainer said that they appreciated this approach. It's essentially starting by saying something positive about the project, explaining the potential risk, and then closing with a positive statement about future collaboration. Number 2, view reports as an educational tool. Maintainers express they're not necessarily familiar with security topics, so include as much detail as possible to help tell a clear story for the maintainer. Some maintainers said that they want to receive notifications in a way that has a few key points, including a summary of the problem, an explanation of the specific issue, the vulnerability's potential impact, and ultimately remediation advice to the extent possible. And lastly, make it actionable and not critical. And finally, I want to leave you with a challenge. You may have your perceptions about each community. So I challenge maintainers and researchers to engage with each other outside of the disclosure process, to build rapport. This will allow for better understanding, more empathy, and ultimately, stronger communication. Thank you.